Hey everyone. Rick Mastracchio was born on February 11th, 1960 in Waterbury, Connecticut. He graduated from Crosby High School in Waterbury in 1978 and received a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science from the University of Connecticut in 1982, a Master's degree in Electrical Engineering from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in 1987, and a Master of Science degree in the Physical Sciences from the University of Houston-Clear Lake in 1991. He worked for Hamilton Standard in Connecticut as an engineer in the Systems Design Group from 1982 until 1987, and during that time he participated in the development of strap-down inertial measurement units and flight control computers. In 1987, he moved to Houston, Texas to work for the Rockwell Shuttle Operations Company and the Johnson Space Center. In 1990, he joined NASA as an engineer in the Flight Crew Operations Directorate, and his duties included the development of space shuttle flight software requirements, the verification of space shuttle flight software in the Shuttle Avionics Integration Laboratory, and the development of ascent and abort crew procedures for the Astronaut Office. From 1993 to 1996, he worked as an Ascent and Entry Guidance Procedures Officer in Mission Control. During that time, he supported 17 missions as flight controller. In April 1996, Mastracchio was selected as an astronaut candidate and started training in August 1996. He has worked technical issues for the Astronaut Office Computer Support Branch, Space Station Operations, the EVA branch, and as a capsule communicator. He served as the display lead for the Space Shuttle cockpit avionics upgrades in 2003, and from 2004 to 2009, he has worked various constellation and Orient tasks, including cockpit design lead and constellation deputy branch chief. Please join me in warmly welcoming Rick Mastracchio.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? You hear me? Yes? All right. Thanks for that introduction. Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me here to Taft School. I did grow up. I was born and raised in Waterbury, Connecticut. And I attended the University of Connecticut. And after I graduated from the University of Connecticut, was working as an engineer up here in Connecticut, Hamilton Standard, designing guidance systems. And then I was working there a few years, and I decided it was time to do something new, when my wife saw an advertisement in a magazine that said NASA is hiring astronauts. And so I thought, wow, wouldn't that be neat to see what an astronaut application looks like? So I sent away for an astronaut application thinking, wow, it's probably this really neat form, right? This is back in the 80s. So NASA sent me the application. Of course, it's just this plain, boring government form, and I kind of threw it in a drawer and forgot about it for a while. And then the Space Shuttle Challenger accident happened back in the 86, and I decided, well, NASA is going to be rebuilding, so I decided to send in that application. So I sent in the NASA astronaut application, and NASA called me a few months later and said, hey, we want you to come down. We want you to come down and work as an engineer, not as an astronaut, but come down and work as an engineer. And I said, that's great. It's a great opportunity. So I just picked up my wife and my two small children. We flew down to Houston, Texas. And so for those next few years, I worked as an engineer at the Johnson Space Center, but I continued to apply as an astronaut. I got my master's degree at night. I got my second master's degree at night. I went out and got my pilot's license. I continued to apply as an astronaut until finally I got interviewed for the astronaut selection. Now the way this works, imagine if you will, kind of like maybe it's like trying to get into Taft School where 10 or 20,000 people are applying for this job. And then they interview about 150 of those people, and then they select about 20 of those people as astronauts. So you can imagine the competition is very fierce to get selected as an astronaut. So my first interview, the fact that I got interviewed, I was very happy about, but I did not get selected. So I continued to work at the Johnson Space Center, continued to apply, continued to try to make myself astronaut material, if you will, and got interviewed again a second time. And again, I did not get selected. So again, continued to try, until my third application, or my third interview in 1996. I got interviewed, and then I did get selected as an astronaut in 1996. But it took me 9 years of sending in applications and 3 interviews before I was finally selected as an astronaut. So perseverance pays off. It doesn't, just because you fail on the first try. You know, I like to tell that story because It really motivates me, I'll be honest with you. A lot of people say, well, you need to motivate people by encouraging them, and that is a really good way to motivate folks. But the other way to motivate me, and motivate a lot of people, is tell them no. No, you cannot do that. And when somebody tells me, no, I can't do something, that just makes me want it more. And that's how I felt like NASA was when I wasn't being selected as an astronaut. So I continued to push harder and harder, and my perseverance paid off, and I got selected. So since that time, I've been since that time at the Johnson Space Center. Let's see if this thing works. Spent a lot of time as an engineer working on the Space Shuttle program. Space Shuttle is an interesting vehicle. We flew it from 1981 to 2011. We retired the Space Shuttle in 2011 after we completed building the International Space Station. I worked on the Space Shuttle quite a bit. I worked in mission control as a flight controller. Basically, you've seen this probably in movies and on television shows. Mission control in Houston's this big room where the flight controllers sit there and help command and work on the Space Shuttle. Now, since then, I've flown 3 Space Shuttle missions. I flew a Space Shuttle mission in 2000, on Space Shuttle Atlantis, 2007, on Space Shuttle Endeavour, 2010, on Space Shuttle Discovery. Now, Space Shuttle is an interesting vehicle. It's like a pickup truck. The best analogy I could come up with. This little area here, this compartment here, that's the crew compartment. So the crew lives in that very, very small area. This is the payload bay. This huge payload bay is that's where we put the large pieces of the space station, and that's why I call it a pickup truck. We use the Space Shuttle to carry these large pieces of space station up to low Earth orbit so that we could assemble them up there. Space Shuttle has 3 main engines, and they're fueled by, see this big orange tank? That's the external tank. It's 500,000 gallons of fuel feed these 3 main engines. 2 solid rocket boosters, each one taller than the Statue of Liberty. Together, this stack weighs about 4.5 million pounds, but provides about 7.5 million pounds of thrust. So, interesting story I like to tell about the external tank. The external tank first flew 1981. The Wright brothers' first flight of an airplane was 1903, thereabouts. The Wright brothers' airplane can fit inside the external tank. That's how big our fuel tank is. But that's not the only thing. The first flight of the Wright brothers' airplane could fit inside the external tank. So that's one big fuel tank. I also flew my last mission in 2013, end of 2013, I launched on a Soyuz rocket, Russian Soyuz rocket out of Kazakhstan. So since the Space Shuttle program has been retired in 2011, we rely on our space station partners, the Russian Space Agency, to get into low Earth orbit. So I launched in end of 2013, I launched on a Soyuz rocket out of Kazakhstan for a 6-month stay. I lived up there for 188 days on board the International Space Station with a Russian cosmonaut and a Japanese astronaut. It's kind of funny, the Soyuz was originally designed in the late 60s. The Soyuz capsule is this little thing right up there. It was originally designed in the late 60s to go to the moon, the Soyuz capsule, but it never went there. But so now the Russians have been using it very successfully for many, many years to go into low Earth orbit. Of course, they upgrade it year to year. I've done a lot of spacewalks. I've done 9 spacewalks. I've spent over 50 hours working in space, inside a spacesuit. A lot of my initial spacewalks were on board the Space Shuttle. Like I said, when we were building the International Space Station, the Space Shuttle was like a pickup truck. We would put large components inside the payload bay of the Space Shuttle. We'd launch the Space Shuttle into low Earth orbit, and then we would use a robotic arm, grab the module, pull the piece out, plug it into the space station. I would suit up in my spacesuit, and I would go out and I would bolt together pieces of the space station, do the electrical connectors, do the fluid lines and things like that. So I did a lot of spacewalks to build the International Space Station. I've done spacewalks to repair parts of the space station. I've done spacewalks to replace empty tanks. On Christmas Eve, not last Christmas, Christmas before last, on Christmas Eve, I spent about 7.5 hours outside doing a spacewalk, replacing a large ammonia pump to save the International Space Station because the cooling system had actually failed. So some spacewalks I've done were 7.5 hours. The last one I did about 1.5 years ago was only 1.5 hours, so a very short one, actually an unusually short one. Now, I've been to the space station 4 times. Every time I've been to the space station, it's grown bigger and bigger. When I was first there in 2000, it was just a few components. Nobody was living there yet. The first people moved in about a month after I got there. Then the space station in 2007 was much bigger. 3 people were permanently living on board the International Space Station. Then in 2010, 6 people were living on board the International Space Station. And I'd like to say, so I think it's coming up in about a month, we've had 15 years of continuous presence on board the International Space Station. People have been living on the space station continuously for the last 15 years. Not the same people, but we rotate usually roughly every 6 months or so. I've been in orbit with a lot of different people, 36 people or so, on all my different missions. Now, so what is the space station? Let's talk a little more detail about that. Of course, it was built by many different countries. It's an international space station. We have Russia and the United States are the major partners. Japan, Canada, and the European Space Agency are also big players. European Space Agency consists of, it's a dozen or more countries over in Europe: France, Italy, Spain, etc. So that's kind of the building sequence that we went through. Now imagine, all these components of space station were built all around the world. Russia, the United States, Europe, Japan, and then all these components were not assembled here on Earth. They were brought up into low Earth orbit and assembled in low Earth orbit. These pieces had never come together until we got into low Earth orbit. So it was an amazing task of engineering to try to make sure these pieces all fit together perfectly up in low Earth orbit. And that was our job as spacewalkers, to go out there and assemble them. So this is what the space station looks like today, fully built. It's a million pounds, over 1 million pounds of hardware launched and built by over a dozen different countries, assembled in low Earth orbit. And now it's an orbiting research laboratory. It goes around the world every 90 minutes. We circle the Earth every 90 minutes on board the International Space Station. That means we get 45 minutes a day, 45 minutes a night, and we continue. 16 sunrises, 16 sunsets a day. And we're up there doing research 24/7. Over probably 200 different experiments going on at any one time. It's all solar powered, solar arrays. We absorb the light, charge up the batteries in the daytime. When we go behind the Earth at night, we use those batteries to power the space station and all its systems. 6 people living up there basically for the last 5 years. So, I do a lot of these presentations. I talk to a lot of different folks, and I get a lot of different questions. But it seems to be a very often it's the similar questions. So, what does a launch feel like? What's the best part of space flight? And of course, what's the worst part of space flight? How do you live up there? How do you eat? How do you sleep? How do you go to the bathroom? Why do you go to space? What are we doing up there? And what's a spacewalk like? What do you do for fun? So when you're living up there for 188 days, you have to have some fun. And what is NASA doing for the people on Earth? And how about movies? How accurate are they? And then what's next for the space program? We retired the space shuttle. NASA has retired the space shuttle. We're relying on the Russians to fly us into low Earth orbit. So what's going to happen next with NASA? I've been places where people have said, I heard NASA went out of business when the space shuttle program retired. NASA's not out of business. I think those people who were living on board the space station wouldn't argue that about NASA being out of business. So, all right, what does a launch feel like? Well, let's see if I can try to show you here. Audio. So what does it look like on the inside? Here we are getting ready for launch. The commander's on the right side, pilot on the left. I'm the flight engineer in the middle of the seat. This is right before liftoff. So you can see a little bit of shaking. The 3 engines have lit. 7 seconds later, the SRBs are going to light. There's the SRBs. There's the shaking. When the SRBs light, you're shaking like crazy. It's kind of like if you rode a motorcycle down a train track. That's the level of vibrations. The space shuttle is now rotating to its proper trajectory. You do this for about 2 minutes. It's called first stage with the solid rocket boosters. Once the solid rocket boosters burn out, watch the bright flash. Solid rocket boosters separate from the stack using separation motors. Once they separate, you're riding on just the 3 main engines with the external tank feeding fuel to the space shuttle. It's like very, very smooth when you're riding on the 3 main engines. It's like electric engines, some people say. But now you're pushing harder and harder. You're pulling 3 Gs. Imagine about 500 pounds sitting on your chest for a couple of minutes. And then you go, boom, you're MECO, main engine cut off, and you're weightless. You go from weighing about 500 pounds to weightless in a split second. You can see everything's flying all over the place because you're in weightlessness and everything is just going to go everywhere. First thing we do is people jump out of their seats and we start taking pictures of that big external tank we have. And we separate from that big external tank and we want to take photographs of it as it tumbles back to Earth. So that's what that's the folks in the back of the window are doing. One is taking still photos, one is taking video. As the flight engineer, myself, and the pilot and commander configured the vehicle to convert it from a spaceship to from a rocket ship to a spaceship. So the space shuttle has 3 configurations. It's a rocket ship, it's a spaceship, and then when it re-enters, it's like an airplane. It was a very versatile, very capable vehicle, spacecraft. So that's what a space shuttle launch looks like. I've also launched on a Soyuz rocket out of Kazakhstan. This is a Russian Soyuz rocket. They launch out of the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. This one was actually had a special paint job to celebrate the Sochi Winter Olympics that were held in Russia less than 2 years ago. They did a special paint job here. A much smaller rocket. Soyuz is a much smaller rocket than the space shuttle. So it doesn't jump off the launch pad as quickly, but of course it still gets you to the same final speed. You have to achieve escape velocity about 5 miles a second you're traveling when you reach low Earth orbit. It's all liquid-fueled engines. It was a beautiful day in Kazakhstan on that launch. And then so what does it look like on the inside? Space shuttle is a roomy vehicle. Maybe it didn't look roomy to you, but a space shuttle is a very roomy spacecraft in my book. So here we are. Here I am on the right side, the Russian commander in the center, and the Japanese astronaut in the left side. I'm kind of the co-pilot of this vehicle. So we had just achieved low Earth orbit, and we were doing some orbital maneuvers. You can see this is our 0G indicator in the upper left, the little stuffed bear. When the little stuffed bear is hanging down, that means the motor is lit and you are actually accelerating the vehicle. So here we are doing a burn. We're monitoring our trajectory. We're making sure things are happening that are supposed to. The engine is burning. Once the bear starts to float, that means the engine turned off. It's a very sophisticated instrument. There you go. The bear is floating. The engine is turned off. Looked good to me. So from liftoff until docking with the International Space Station is 6 hours. So it's more than enough time to have a couple of snacks. We packed some snacks in there with us, some little drink boxes, things like that. So we celebrated with a couple of protein bars. 6 hours after liftoff, you're docking with the International Space Station to start your 188 days on the International Space Station. Let me just go back. The space shuttle missions are 2-week missions generally, 14, 16, 12 to 16-day missions. They're like construction missions. You go up there, you do construction, you work hard for 2 weeks, you come home. Space station is a utilization. We call them expeditions or utilization missions. That's where you're going up there to live and work on the International Space Station. And mine was 188 days. So here's the Soyuz capsule from the outside as it's approaching the International Space Station. You got solar arrays, you got antennas, docking mechanism right there. It's a very small capsule, approaches the space station. You're traveling 5 miles a second. Here's your space station. You're coming in. There's the crosshair you can see out the window from the Soyuz. If you watch carefully, you can actually see jets firing. Here we are approaching and docking very, very smoothly. Once you dock with the International Space Station, of course, there's a lot of work to do. You got to hard dock the Soyuz capsule, make sure it's secure. You get off, you take your spacesuits off, you equalize pressure between the Soyuz and the space station, you open the hatches, and it's time to start your mission. Space shuttle approach is a little bit different. When the space shuttle used to approach the International Space Station, we used to do this fast flip maneuver. maneuver. We want to expose the underbelly. See the underbelly of the shuttle right there? We want to expose that underbelly to the International Space Station, to the folks. The crew on board the space station takes high-resolution photos of the space shuttle as it's approaching, because we want to send those pictures down to the ground, to Houston, to make sure that the tile, the thermal protection system, wasn't damaged during launch. So that's why we do that flip maneuver. So let's talk about the difference. Well, the space shuttle is a winged vehicle. Soyuz is a capsule. Apollo from the old 60s US vehicle was a capsule. A lot of vehicles are capsules. Shuttles, basically the only known manned winged spacecraft. Winged spacecraft are much more complicated, much more difficult to operate. It's kind of like an airplane. When you fly an airplane has to maintain a very specific attitude and orientation as it's traveling through the atmosphere. You try to fly an airplane sideways, that thing is just going to tumble and break up due to aerodynamic forces. Same thing with a space shuttle. A space shuttle has to maintain a very specific attitude as it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere. The thermal protection system is down here. If you tried to enter it too steep or too high, you would burn up different parts of the space shuttle and it would break up. If you enter it at a sideways attitude, it would break apart. So a capsule is different. A capsule is like a badminton birdie. When you throw or hit a badminton birdie, it doesn't matter how you throw it. You could spin it, you could throw it sideways. It doesn't matter how you throw it. What does it do? It always achieves a certain attitude and orientation. It has one stable orientation. That's what a capsule does. A capsule has often one stable, sometimes two stable orientations. So if a capsule has a problem, you lose your control system, or you have some kind of problem with a capsule, it's going to achieve some kind of stable orientation. It's going to re-enter the atmosphere such that the thermal protection system protects you in the way it was designed to. So it's much safer. It's a much simpler vehicle, a capsule is. And that's why we're going back to capsules. That's why we retired the space shuttle after we finished the International Space Station. It was an incredible vehicle. It was a fun vehicle to be a part of, but capsules are a little cheaper and a little bit safer, and that's why we're going back to them. So you can see the space shuttle's thermal protection system is all exposed. All those tiles on the underbelly are exposed. Whereas the Soyuz capsule and the Apollo capsules, the thermal protection system was covered by other pieces of hardware, and it did not get exposed until you needed it on re-entry. So there's a comparison of the space shuttle versus the Soyuz. The Soyuz is a small one, obviously. Space shuttle's up here. You could fit, I don't know, probably half a dozen Soyuz just inside the space shuttle's payload bay. So I was happy to fly and get a chance to work on the space shuttle, but it was also a great experience to fly on the Soyuz. A great vehicle, very reliable. All right, so why do we go to space? No matter how you get to space, once you get to the International Space Station, you're going to live and work up there for a long period of time. So why are you going up there? What are we doing up there? Well, like I said, it's a research laboratory. It's an orbiting research laboratory, world class. Here I am working on an experiment. This is called antibiotic effectiveness on E. coli in a zero-G environment. This is basically a thermally controlled box, basically nothing much more than a fancy cooler. I take these canisters, and these canisters are filled with E. coli and an antibiotic, and they're separated by these plungers. I crank these plungers to mix the E. coli and the antibiotics together, give it a little bit of a shake, and then we put it back in the box for a while until I come back to it. I think it was the next day. I come back to it, I crank it again, and I fixate the samples. What does that mean? Fixate the samples, basically kind of like, it's probably a form of formaldehyde of some kind, where it freezes, it stops the chemical reaction and the changes in the E. coli and the antibiotics. We stick them in a freezer, we freeze these samples, we send them down to the ground for the scientists. So what they're doing is they're trying to see how effective the antibiotics are on this E. coli. So why do we have to do that in zero-G? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. Things behave differently in a zero-G environment. We're finding that bacteria is much stronger in a zero-G environment, kind of like the superbugs that we're finding here on Earth. Bacteria is much stronger, so we're trying to develop new antibiotics to try to counter that kind of thing. Another experiment is ants in space. So it's very complicated. Basically, we took ants and we brought them up into space. They're in this little compartment right here, just normal little sidewalk ants. They flew up here, and then I opened up this bigger compartment, and the ants came out, and they went foraging. They did kind of like I call it a three-dimensional foraging technique. And what we were doing was we were videotaping these guys and sending it down to the ground, watching them forage. It was a lot of fun to watch them, actually. It was obviously an educational experiment. There was a lot of kids, a lot of students on the ground who were following us, but it also had scientific applications. They were saying that there were scientists who were going to try to monitor. They had software, tracking software, to watch how these ants would forage and walk around, and there's different what seemingly random patterns. And they wanted to come up with algorithms on how these ants went out and foraged. And if you think about it, if I put a crumb on this stage and there's an ant pile somewhere far away, eventually the ants are going to find that crumb. How the heck did those ants find that crumb so far away? Well, they have their techniques. We want to know how. These scientists want to know how they do that. So what's the applications here on Earth? Well, you know, these small little drones are very popular, right? Probably maybe half of us will get them for Christmas this year. Imagine a swarm of these drones, and we program them with some kind of foraging algorithms that these ants use, and somebody's lost in the desert or somebody's lost in the woods, and we launch a swarm of these drones programmed with these algorithms, and these drones go out and they search and they find this person wandering in the desert or something like that. So all these things, it's amazing how these scientists think, how they look and they see an ant and they wonder, how come an ant can find a crumb on the ground, and how can I use that to improve life here on Earth? I never would have came up with that idea. I'll tell you, it's pretty impressive. These are Spheres satellites. These are small satellites that we fly around inside the space station. They're pressured, or they're powered by CO2 gas jets. They're battery powered with CO2 gas jets, and they move around and they do these different things. They're going through this little dance here. And this is pretty interesting stuff, because what's interesting about these little satellites is they're programmable from the ground. We have MIT PhD students who are uplinking their control theories, their control algorithms, their programs for how to control satellites into these things, and they're having us test out their control algorithms for their PhD thesis, for example. But then we're also using these things for high school students. This is maybe something you guys want to look into. High school students are setting up their programs. They're having competitions where different high schools are getting together. One of them is programming the red satellite, and one of them is programming the blue satellite, and these two satellites have a competition in orbit with the high school students' algorithms programmed into them. And then there's certain ways that they get scored. Your algorithm gets scored and you win, or you lose your competition, and then it's kind of a round robin and you keep going. So it's kind of fun, because students can participate from all over the world in these Sphere satellites, and they're really kind of fun just to kind of watch them putz around. That's Oleg Kotov with me, one of my Russian crewmates. Like I said, space station, international place. I've been in orbit with Russian cosmonauts, of course a lot of US astronauts, Japanese astronauts, several of them, Canadian astronauts, Italian astronauts, other astronauts from Europe. So it really is a very international place. English is the main language on the International Space Station, but Russian is also required. I was basically the co-pilot on a Russian Soyuz spacecraft, so I did have to learn how to speak Russian in order to control and communicate with Russia mission control in Moscow. All right, so what's a spacewalk like? A spacewalk is the best part of spaceflight, in my opinion. Spacewalk is also the hardest part in terms of the difficult amount of work. You have to build your spacesuit. We have to assemble our spacesuits. We have to test our tools. Everything is tethered. We have to check every inch of string. We have checklists. We have bags of tools that we have to put together. We have wire ties we have to pull out and wire tie to our tools. You can see all the tools here. You wear all your tools on your chest when you're out on a spacewalk, and everything is tethered. If you don't tether a tool, if you drop a tool in space, it doesn't fall at your feet. It floats away, and you lost that wrench forever, until 90 minutes later, unless it comes back and hits you in the back of the head 90 minutes later once you go around the Earth. So you got to be really careful. A lot of work to prepare for a spacewalk. A lot of folks want to be astronauts. They want to launch into space. That's a really common thing amongst folks that I talk to. And then once you become an astronaut, what every astronaut wants to do, they want to do a spacewalk. That's the next step in experiencing space. It's kind of like I compare it to, like, if you want to go on a boat ride. When you're on a boat ride, what do you want to do? You want to jump in the water and swim around. That's what an astronaut is like when he's up in space. He wants to jump out into space. Of course, you have to do it with your spacesuit on. So what's a space? The best part of spaceflight, like I said, is a spacewalk. So here's how you do a spacewalk. There's no walking involved, as you can see. I don't know why we call it spacewalking, but my feet are definitely not being used. It's all hand-over-hand translation. Hand-over-hand translation. Here I am traversing down the International Space. That's about a 50-foot. That's obviously sped up. I don't move that fast. But hand-over-hand translation. Imagine you're in a vacuum of space, but your suit is pressurized to like 4.3 psi. So imagine, if you will, you're working in gloves that are pressurized at 4.3 psi. So what that means, it's like take a tennis ball and squeeze a tennis ball nonstop for about 7 hours. That's how much work. Your hands and your forearms are highly fatigued when you get done with a spacewalk. It takes a lot of upper body and forearm strength to do these things. And of course, the best part of the spacewalk is you get to take a few selfies, publish them on Twitter. This was one of the selfies of the year in 2013. The funny part of it, this is a selfie of my crewmate Mike Hopkins. The funny part was I took the picture. It wasn't really a selfie, but we let him think it is because it's a great shot. All right, so how do we live up there? You're up there 188 days, and people always say to me, wow, how did you do it? I said, well, each day, every day went by very, very fast, but there was a lot of days. So we do stay busy up there, but we do have to live up there. So how do you sleep? Well, we sleep in these small compartments. We call them our crew quarters. So it's basically, there's a crew quarter that's on the port side. There's one on the ceiling. There's one on the starboard side somewhere. Can't see it when I'm too close. There it is, starboard side, and there's one on the deck. I slept on the one in the deck, on the floor, if you will. So how do you sleep inside something like this? Well, it's basically just a small closet. You can see I've got a sleeping bag hanging on the wall. I've got some personal family photos in the back. I have a couple of computers. This computer is used for official work, emails, and looking at my schedule. The computer next to me looks like I even have Twitter up there at the time. I was probably sending a tweet. That actually connects to the internet. Pretty bad internet connection. And of course, when you want some privacy, you just close the door. It's a very small room. It's basically, if you guys ever know what a phone booth is or a linen closet, it's a very small closet. But it's great. It gives you some personal time. So how do you sleep in the ceiling? Well, there is no up and down. You don't fall out of bed. How do you sleep standing up? There is no up and down in space. You can sleep in any orientation you want. And it's perfectly comfortable because you're a weightless environment. You kind of just sleep there like this and your hands kind of float. It's dinner time here on the International Space Station. So the first step is selecting your food. Today I've chosen broccoli au gratin. It's a freeze-dried, vacuum-packed. And I also am going to have some meatloaf with that. That's in a kind of an MRE type of container. I'll finish it up with some freeze-dried strawberries. And of course, I've got my drink bag. This is a hint of orange. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to rehydrate these three products. So come on and follow me to the rehydrator. It's 50 milliliters of cold water for my strawberries for dessert. What I'll do is I'll actually put these, we have actually a very small refrigerator. I'll put these in and make them cold so after dinner, when I'm ready to eat these, they'll be ready to go. They'll actually be cold. So 50 milliliters. See the water there? So there it is. The water obviously is just sitting there. It takes a little while for it to get absorbed into the package. Sometimes you have to help it by kneading it a little bit. On the refrigerator here. See here, we got a very small refrigerator. Now, in space shuttle missions, we never have refrigerated food, so this is definitely a good one. So the food is pretty good up there, a wide selection of it. So how do you work out? After you had a big meal, it's time to exercise. You know, you're in a zero-G environment. You have to exercise every day. So here you do, running on a treadmill. But unfortunately, that's not the floor. This is the floor. This is facing, now I'm facing down on Earth, so I'm looking down as I run on the wall. If you look at my Japanese crewmate behind me, he's doing heel raises with his feet on the ceiling. He's probably doing, or shoulder shrugs maybe. And then the box with the moon on it, well, that's the toilet, where the toilet sits on the floor down here. So you can see I'm running on the wall, he's exercising on the ceiling, and then when you use the toilet, it's on the floor. So there is no up and down in space. So you could do things in all different orientations, obviously. And you can see how you exercise. We have to exercise 2 hours a day. I spent probably 45 minutes or so on the treadmill. Had to wear a harness. You wear a harness, and then you use bungee cords to pull you down onto the treadmill. And you could adjust those bungee cords anywhere from 100 to 200 pounds of force, depending on your body weight. When you first get up there, you start kind of light, and then you work your way back up to your body weight. So it's very painful on the shoulders and the hips because all your body weight now is in just a couple little spots instead of distributed throughout your whole body. But that's how we run on a treadmill. And the weightlifting is a resistive exercise device. It's basically a pneumatic canister that is adjustable, so we could adjust the resistance on it, and you could do up to 600 pounds of bench presses and leg lifts and things like that. All right, so what's the worst part of spaceflight, as you could imagine? It's using the bathroom.
Yeah, that's sorry, Dermot. Yeah, you're right. You caught me in the loo here right now. You know, obviously on Earth, you guys have the luxury of gravity to pull any waste material away from the body. Up here, we have to use airflow. You know, for liquids, we have a hose with a funnel. For solids, we basically got a can, kind of like you might use something for this, like camping. And yeah, you're right. We have to recycle all our water. It's just too expensive and too difficult to launch every drop of water that we need up here on the International Space Station. So we recycle our water. We have a system that uses distillation process and many, many filters to purify the urine into drinking water the next day or so. And you know, if you think about it, Dermot, all the water that you drink on the Earth, that's all been recycled many, many times by Mother Nature. We're just doing it using technology up here.
Sure, that's fantastic. And is that technology...
Yeah, so that was a live TV show. I had to explain on live TV to 2 million people how to use the toilet. That's pressure. But yeah, the toilet is obviously, I like to say, space is the place where the impossible things become easy. You're flying at 5 miles a second, you're lifting up thousands of pounds, no problem. You're going around the Earth every 90 minutes. You're seeing places and seeing things you've never seen, will never see again. But yet, simple things like making your food, going to the bathroom, tying your shoes, all those things get much, much more difficult in space. All right. And then what do you do for fun? Well, obviously the best thing to do for fun when you're in space is to look at the Earth. We have a cupola on board the International Space Station. The cupola is basically like a glass-bottom boat. It's hanging on the bottom of the International Space Station. It's got windows all the way around it, 6 windows. That's what this view is trying to show you, the windows all the way around it. And then it's got a big window at the bottom. So it's basically like a glass-bottom boat. So we kind of float in there, and you could see basically half the Earth. For thousands of miles away, we could see. That's one of our robotic arms here. So we spend a lot of time in the cupola looking out the window. And these are some of the views that we see. The first one here, this is a trip over Europe. You got the Mediterranean Sea, Europe to your left, Africa to your right. These are all city lights. This is basically, obviously, at nighttime. You can see some cloud coverage there. Here comes Italy. You got Sicily right there. There's the boot of Italy. Probably Germany right up here somewhere, covered with a little bit of clouds. And then going off into other Eastern Europe, and then over into Russia. So beautiful views of the night, of the skylights. Here's the east coast of the United States. You got New York City, Philadelphia, let's see, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. Great views. Again, city lights are one of my favorite things to see. Let's see, and then there's a close-up of New York City. I just wanted to show you that. So you could really see this stuff really well up there. Here's what it looks like in the daytime. Here's another view of, that's Sicily, Mount Etna right there. This is basic, this is kind of real time. It depends how fast you're moving, how fast it looks like it's moving is a function of how much you zoom in. So that's kind of zoomed in quite a bit, so it looks like you're moving pretty fast. Again, you're moving at 5 miles a second, so you are moving pretty quick. And then you can see the boot of Italy coming into view. Here's a great view. My Japanese crewmate took this picture. Skipped it. That's a view of a volcano erupting. Can you imagine the timing as we flew in our space station? We flew over this volcano erupting over in one of the peninsulas far on the west coast of Russia. That's the plume as it rises up through the atmosphere. New York City, Long Island, Connecticut. There's New Haven, Waterbury, Watertown up there. Let's see if we could zoom in on that a little bit. There you go, Lake Winnemog. I guess Watertown's up here in this area. You could probably find Taft School if we zoomed in a little bit more on that. So you get a lot of great shots. It was up there during the winter. That's why those pictures are not very pretty, because it was winter, and you guys were experiencing a really tough winter. That was the year before last. The big thing we like to look at are the aurora borealis, the northern lights. You get these waves of green light coming off the planet as we fly through them. It's an incredible show. Some nights it's just lasts for hours and hours, and sometimes you won't see it for weeks. So incredibly beautiful show. So that's what we do for fun. So returning to Earth, you've been up there 188 days in the Soyuz, it's time to come home. You basically get back into your Soyuz capsule, put your suits back on, you close the hatch, boom, you push the button, spring-loaded, it pushes you off of the space station, you turn that vehicle around, it actually breaks apart in 3 pieces. The small capsule that you're in achieves the proper orientation, re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, you burn up at 3,000 degrees. Your ablative heat shield in the front of the vehicle is actually burning and melting away. This is the window about 6 inches from my shoulder as the flames and the plasma build up on the window. You re-enter the atmosphere. Once you get through the hottest part, the thickest part of the atmosphere, the parachutes open up. Once the initial parachute shock happens, you are being tossed around like a shoe in a dryer. You feel like you're being tumbled all over the place, and that's why you are strapped into your seat so tight. You do not want to be loose. You come slamming into the ground, you land in the steppes of Kazakhstan, the soft landing engines fire, and you're home after 188 days. NASA folks, Russian technicians, they pick you up, they put you in a helicopter, the Russians put you in a helicopter, fly you over to a local Kazakhstan airport, and a NASA jet takes you home back to Houston. Within 24 hours, you're back in Houston doing more science experiments, because I am a science experiment. So when I return after 188 days in space, they want to know what my body changes have gone through. Space shuttle, much more different entry, much gentler. A Soyuz, you come home, you pull in like 5 Gs. Shuttle, barely at 1.5 Gs. It's kind of like an airplane, basically not much different than an airplane landing. Comes down just like an airplane, gear down. You land at the Kennedy Space Center usually. Sometimes we landed in California, usually in Florida. Beautiful landing, very smooth. Some of the best pilots in the military are flying those things. You come home, drag chute. Your family's right there to meet you. The family's probably about 50 feet off the runway watching the landing, and they're there to greet you right away. So let's see what we got. So how does NASA help the people on Earth? So I'll go through this pretty quick. You know, we do a lot of spin-offs, what we call spin-offs. NASA technology utilized throughout society in different ways. More than 1,500 different spin-offs in all areas, medical, building products, everything, you name it, NASA's been involved in it. Some of the obvious ones, memory foam, used in mattresses now. NASA developed that for crash protection. Digital image processing was designed to process the lunar photos in different ways, now used in magnetic or MRI image processing. Freeze-dried food, we talked about that. That's very popular all around the world, developed by NASA. Food safety, NASA is very strict and concerned about how they don't want to get the astronauts sick when they're eating the food. When you're living on space station for 6 months, that food has to be sent up years in advance. So they really have to know how to package food. NASA came up with processes and standards to process that food, and now the whole world is using that stuff. Liquid-cooled garments, we use them under our spacesuits for years, and now they're used in medical for treatment of burns and spinal injuries or in sport injuries. And there's a whole list more. Even Dr. Michael DeBakey, who just passed away, I believe, NASA worked with him to help him develop an artificial heart pump. So NASA does a lot of stuff, and just before we go, are movies accurate? Well, let's see, how not to spacewalk. You've seen how I do a spacewalk.
And to think he went to Harvard.
That's how not to spacewalk. So what's next for the space program? Like I told you, we're going back to capsules. Orion is going to be a capsule going beyond low Earth orbit. We're already launching test vehicles of this one. We'll be having manned launches here, hopefully in the next 6 or 8 years. It's going to go back to the moon, even to Mars. And NASA's developing that. And then with our commercial companies, we got Boeing and SpaceX, both developing capsules that are going to launch with people on them, hopefully in the next 2 years. So it's a pretty bright future for NASA, especially folks your age. When you get out of college, you'll be ready to go work for NASA and go do some missions into who knows where, the moon, Mars, and beyond. So that's all I got for you today. Thanks.